Cold open, January 1970. A small plane sits on a rain-slicked runway in the dying Republic of Biafra. Inside the cabin is a man who, 3 years earlier, stood before a crowd of hundreds of thousands and declared a new nation into existence. Now he is leaving that nation to die without him. His name is Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu. To some of the millions who followed him, he is Ikemba, the strength of a clan. To the Nigerian federal government he has just lost a war against, he is a fugitive, a secessionist, possibly a war criminal. To history, he is one of the most contested figures Africa produced in the 20th century. Most documentaries about Ojukwu end here, with the surrender, the plane, the 2.5 million dead, the famine that shocked the world through a television screen for the first time in history. That is the story everyone tells. This is not that story. This is the story of what came after. 13 years of exile in a foreign palace, a pardon that divided a nation, a prison cell in Lagos, 2 failed runs for the presidency of the very country he once tried to leave, a funeral with a 21-gun salute, fired by the army that once hunted him. This is what happened to the man after Biafra fell, and why, more than 50 years later, Nigeria still hasn't fully decided what to make of him. Chapter 1. The Last Flight. To understand what happened to Ojukwu after the war, you have to understand exactly how the war ended, because the manner of his departure would follow him for the rest of his life. By late 1969, the Republic of Biafra was a shadow of the territory Ojukwu had declared independent in May 1967. Nigerian federal forces, backed materially by Britain and the Soviet Union, had spent over 2 years squeezing the breakaway state through a punishing blockade. Starvation, not bullets, had become the war's principal weapon. Images of skeletal Biafran children, bellies distended from kwashiorkor, had already made the war one of the first true televised humanitarian catastrophes, beamed into living rooms in London, New York, and beyond. By January 1970, Biafran defenses had effectively collapsed. A gap opened in the front lines, and Nigerian troops poured through it. The end was no longer a question of if, but of hours. On January 9, 1970, Ojukwu made the decision that would define the second half of his life just as much as the war itself defined the first. Rather than surrender alongside his soldiers, he handed executive authority to his second-in-command, Major General Philip Effiong, and boarded a plane out of the collapsing republic. His destination was Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, whose president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, had been one of the few heads of state to formally recognize Biafra's independence back in 1968. Houphouët-Boigny granted Ojukwu political asylum almost immediately. 2 days later, on January 11th or 12th, depending on the account, General Philip Effiong formally surrendered Biafra to federal Nigerian forces. The Nigerian Civil War, the Biafran War, was over. The decision to leave rather than surrender has never stopped being debated. Ojukwu's defenders argue he was advised, even pleaded with, to leave because his presence at a surrender would have triggered immediate execution or, at minimum, a show trial that could have reignited violence against Igbo civilians already living in fear across the country. His critics have never let him forget that the man who declared Biafra into existence, who told his people that, whilst I live, Biafra lives, was not there when Biafra actually died. That single decision, leave or stay, is the hinge on which Ojukwu's entire post-war identity would swing for the next 4 decades. Was he a pragmatic leader protecting his people from a bloodbath, or a man who ran, leaving others to answer for a war he started? He was 36 years old. He would not set foot in Nigeria again for 12 years. Chapter 2, the guest of a president exile for most political refugees means anonymity, poverty, or both. For Ojukwu, it meant something closer to gilded confinement. Houphouët-Boigny did not merely tolerate Ojukwu's presence in Abidjan, he treated the former Biafran leader as a kind of permanent honored guest, a symbol of the Pan-African solidarity Côte d'Ivoire had extended to Biafra during the war. Ojukwu was given security, comfort, and, crucially, silence from Ivorian authorities about extraditing him back to Nigeria. something the Gowon government in Lagos periodically pushed for and never received. It's worth pausing on what Nigeria looked like in these years, because the country Ojukwu was locked out of was changing rapidly without him. General Yakubu Gowon, who had led the federal war effort, publicly framed the post-war period around a policy of reconciliation. "No victor, no vanquished" became the official slogan. Reintegration programs were designed, at least on paper, to bring former Biafran soldiers and officers back into Nigerian civil and military life without prosecution. Many senior Biafran officers did exactly that, resuming careers in a reunified Nigeria within a few years of the surrender. Ojukwu did not. Whether by his own choice, by the practical reality that Gowon's government still wanted him tried, or by some combination of the two, he remained the one prominent Biafran leader who did not come home. Life in Abidjan was, by most accounts, materially comfortable, but personally difficult. Ojukwu had lost a war, lost the presidency of a country that no longer existed on any map, and lost, for the time being, his public relevance. He was a man in his late 30s and then his 40s, watching Nigerian politics unfold entirely without him. The 1975 coup that removed Gowon, the brief and consequential government of Murtala Muhammad, Muhammad's assassination in 1976, and the transition under Olusegun Obasanjo that would eventually hand power back to civilians in 1979. Ojukwu's personal life during exile was similarly turbulent. His first marriage to Njideka Onyekwelu had taken place in 1962, and he had been previously connected to Stella Ojukwu until roughly 1966. During the exile years, accounts describe a relationship with a woman named Stella Onyedor, with whom he adopted a daughter while in Côte d'Ivoire. Ivorian law at the time reportedly restricted women from adopting children independently, which meant custody complications arose when that relationship ended. Ojukwu was awarded sole custody of the child. It is a small human detail largely absent from the official political narrative of Ojukwu's life, but it says something about the ordinary domestic difficulties layered underneath the historical figure. Even a man remembered for a war was, in these years, also just a man dealing with a messy personal life far from home. Politically, Ojukwu was not entirely idle in Abidjan. He continued to write. His 1969 book, Biafra, Selected Speeches and Random Thoughts of C. Odumegwu Ojukwu, had already cemented him as a wartime intellectual voice. In exile gave him time to continue shaping his own historical narrative, one favorable to his version of events. He remained from a distance a reference point for Igbo communities, processing the trauma of the war and the discrimination many felt in its aftermath, particularly around the controversial policy that limited former Eastern Region bank account holders to a flat payout regardless of their pre-war balances. A policy many Igbos considered a form of economic punishment. For 13 years, that was Ojukwu's reality. A man frozen in 1970, watching a country rebuild itself without him, protected by a foreign president's goodwill, waiting for a phone call that, for over a decade, never came. Chapter 3, The Pardon. The call finally came in 1982, and it came from an unlikely source. Shehu Shagari, elected president of Nigeria's Second Republic in 1979, made the decision to grant Ojukwu amnesty, a formal state pardon that would allow him to return to Nigeria without facing prosecution for his role in the Civil War. It was on paper a straightforward act of national healing, more than a decade after the guns had gone silent. In practice, it was one of the more politically calculated decisions of Shagari's presidency. Here is the calculation most historians point to. Shagari's ruling National Party of Nigeria, the NPN, needed to expand its base in the Igbo-dominated Southeast, a region that had largely rallied behind opposition parties in 1979. Ojukwu, despite everything, remained the single most influential figure in Igbo political identity. Bringing him home, and, ideally, bringing him into the NPN's camp, was a play for Southeastern votes ahead of the 1983 elections. On June 18, 1982, Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu walked back onto Nigerian soil for the first time in over 12 years. The reception was, by every account, enormous and enormously divided. In the southeast, and especially among the Igbo people of his home area around Niue, the homecoming was treated less like the return of a defeated general than the return of a king. His people conferred on him the traditional chieftaincy title of Ikemba Niue, the strength of Niue, cementing a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life and beyond it. Young men drawn to his mythology would go on to organize themselves informally as the Ikemba Front, an admiring, sometimes intimidating cohort of loyalists. Visual, if available, crowd footage from his return, otherwise illustrated recreation of large crowds in Igbo elsewhere in Nigeria. The reaction ranged from indifferent to openly hostile. For many non-Igbo Nigerians, and for some Igbos too, particularly minority ethnic groups within the old eastern region, who felt Biafra had never represented their interests, Ojukwu's return reopened a wound rather than closing one. Critics accused Shagari of rehabilitating a man responsible, in their view, for 2.5 million deaths, purely for electoral convenience. Ojukwu himself did not return quietly or apologetically. Almost immediately, he threw himself into legal battles to reclaim property that had been declared abandoned during the war, including buildings tied to his family's business empire, like a WAEC headquarters building in Yaba, Lagos, and a family property in Apapa. He fought, and eventually won, a protracted legal fight to reclaim these assets, signaling early that his return to Nigeria was not going to be a quiet retirement. And then, within months, he did something that surprised almost everyone who had followed his career. He joined Shagari's own party, the NPN, the establishment political machine of the very federal government he had once gone to war against. Chapter 4. The Politician. For a man whose entire identity had been built on defiance of federal Nigerian authority, joining the NPN was a jarring pivot, and it cost him credibility with some of his most devoted supporters. Ojukwu's stated logic was pragmatic. Real influence for the Igbo people, he argued, would come from working inside Nigeria's political system, not from nursing old grievances outside it. His critics, including some former Biafran officials, saw it differently. A former Red Cross coordinator for Biafra was quoted decades later lamenting that Ojukwu should have remained a rallying point instead of diving headfirst into partisan politics so soon after coming home. In 1983, Ojukwu ran for a seat in the Nigerian Senate under the NPN banner. The results were close and immediately contested. Official tallies showed him losing by a margin of roughly 12,000 votes. A Nigerian court initially moved to overturn that result in his favor that September, but the entire question became moot within months, for reasons that had nothing to do with Ojukwu at all. On December 31, 1983, the Shagari government was overthrown in a military coup led by Major General Muhammadu Buhari, alongside Major General Tunde Idiagbon. The Second Republic, and Ojukwu's brief experiment in electoral politics as an NPN candidate, collapsed with it. What came next was, in some ways, the strangest chapter of Ojukwu's post-war life. In early 1984, the new Buhari military regime rounded up hundreds of politicians from the fallen civilian government as part of a broad anti-corruption crackdown. Ojukwu, despite never having held federal office, despite having lost his own Senate race, was swept up in the arrests and detained at Kirikiri Maximum Security Prison in Lagos, one of Nigeria's most notorious correctional facilities. Visual, exterior shots of Kirikiri Prison, or period-appropriate imagery of Nigerian prisons in the 1980s. It is a detail that rarely makes it into shorter retellings of Ojukwu's biography, and it's worth sitting with. The man who led an entire breakaway republic, who spent 13 years in comfortable asylum as a foreign president's guest, spent part of 1984 behind bars in his own country. Not for the war, but for a brief and unsuccessful stint as a mainstream party politician. He was released later that year as Nigeria's military government worked through its detentions and largely stepped back from frontline active politics for the remainder of the 1980s. The episode underscored something that would repeat across the rest of Ojukwu's life. He could never quite occupy an ordinary political lane. He was either the most consequential man in a room or a curiosity swept up in someone else's crackdown. rarely anything comfortably in between. Chapter 5. The private man away from courtrooms, prisons, and party conventions. Ojukwu's personal life in the years after his return continued to draw as much public fascination as his politics. In 1994, at the age of 61, Ojukwu married Bianca Ono, a 21-year-old lawyer and former Miss Intercontinental Beauty Queen, 30 years his junior. The marriage was notably opposed by Bianca's father, the politician Chief C.C. Ono, who reportedly objected to the age gap and fought the union for a prolonged period before it went ahead. It was Ojukwu's third marriage, and it would prove to be his last and most publicly visible. Bianca Ojukwu would go on to become a public figure in her own right, later serving Nigeria as an ambassador. Together they had 3 children, Afamefuna, Shinemi, and Nwachukwu. It's tempting, looking back, to read Ojukwu's personal life as a kind of parallel track running alongside his political one. Messy, headline-grabbing, occasionally scandalous, but ultimately a reminder that the man mythologized as Ikemba was still navigating an ordinary human life of relationships, custody disputes, family disapproval, and eventually a high-profile marriage that outlasted the controversy that preceded it. By the mid-1990s, Ojukwu was in his 60s, remarried, financially secure through reclaimed family business interests, and increasingly positioned, whether he sought the role explicitly or not, as an elder statesman for the Igbo nation within a united Nigeria. The war generation was aging. A new political era and a new political vehicle was about to bring him back to the national stage one final time. Chapter 6. The Presidential Candidate. Nigeria's return to civilian democracy in 1999, after over a decade and a half of military rule, opened a new chapter for the country, and by extension, for Ojukwu. In the early 2000s, Ojukwu became closely associated with the All Progressives Grand Alliance, APGA, a political party that positioned itself explicitly as a champion of Igbo political interests within the framework of a unified Nigeria. For many observers, the symbolism was impossible to miss. Nearly 3 decades after leading a secessionist war, Ojukwu was now the face of a party arguing for Igbo empowerment through the ballot box rather than the battlefield. In 2003, Ojukwu ran for president of Nigeria on the APGA platform. He lost. The election was won by incumbent Olusegun Obasanjo, running under the People's Democratic Party. Ojukwu tried again in 2007 and again fell short as Umaru Musa Yar'Adua claimed victory in an election that international observers criticized heavily for irregularities across the board, not specific to Ojukwu's candidacy. Neither campaign came close to winning nationally, and it would be inaccurate to suggest Ojukwu was ever a serious contender for the Nigerian presidency in the way Obasanjo or Yar'Adua were. But that arguably wasn't the point. For Ojukwu and for the base of supporters who rallied around APGA in the Southeast, these campaigns functioned as something closer to a decades-delayed referendum. Could the man who once led Biafra out of Nigeria now credibly lead a segment of Nigeria back into full national relevance, peacefully through democratic participation? The answer, electorally, was no. But the attempt itself mattered to how Ojukwu would ultimately be remembered, not merely as the general who lost a war, but as a man who spent his final active political years trying, imperfectly and unsuccessfully, to convert that old wartime authority into a peaceful, constitutional one. By this stage of his life, the imagery around Ojukwu had shifted almost entirely. The soldier's uniform of the late 1960s had given way to the elaborate chieftaincy regalia of an Igbo traditional title holder. The wartime radio addresses had given way to campaign rallies. The man was the same. The costume and the stakes were not. Chapter 7. Decline and Death. In his final years, Ojukwu's health began to decline. He suffered a stroke and, in the years leading up to his death, spent increasing amounts of time abroad in the United Kingdom for medical treatment, a detail that quietly underscores the limits of Nigeria's own healthcare infrastructure, even for a man of Ojukwu's wealth and stature. On November 26, 2011, Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu died in London following a brief illness. He was 78 years old. The reaction across Nigeria was immediate and, in a way that would have been recognizable to anyone who had followed his life since 1970, deeply divided even in mourning. Then President Goodluck Jonathan, himself from the Niger Delta region, not the Igbo Southeast, arranged for Ojukwu's body to be returned to Nigeria and granted him a full state funeral, an extraordinary honor for a man who had once led an armed secession against the Nigerian state. Ojukwu was buried with full military honors, including a 21-gun salute fired by the Nigerian army, the same institution that had spent nearly 3 years trying to defeat him on the battlefield, now rendering him the state's highest ceremonial tribute. Thousands of mourners attended services across multiple locations, particularly in his home region in the southeast, where the funeral took on the scale and emotional weight of a national event for the Igbo people specifically, even if the rest of the country's reaction was more muted or ambivalent. It is one of the more striking ironies of Ojukwu's story. The federal government that once wanted him tried, possibly executed for treason, ultimately buried him as a full state dignitary. Nigeria in the end extended to Ojukwu in death the kind of formal reconciliation it had only partially, awkwardly extended to him in life. Chapter 8. The Unresolved Legacy. So what do we make of the 4 decades that came after Biafra? Strip away the mythology in either direction, and the post-war life of Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu resists a clean narrative. He was not simply a defeated warlord who slunk away in disgrace, nor was he simply the returning hero of Igbo nationalism that some retellings prefer. He was, across 13 years of exile and nearly 30 years back in Nigeria, a man who tried on almost every available identity a former rebel leader could try on. Asylum seeker, litigant reclaiming lost property, mainstream party candidate, political prisoner, husband and father, traditional chief, opposition presidential candidate, and finally elder statesman honored at death by the very state he once fought. To many Igbo Nigerians, especially those who lived through the war or grew up in its shadow, Ojukwu's post-war life reads as a story of resilience and unfinished vindication. A man who never renounced the legitimacy of Biafra's cause, who spent his later decades trying to secure through politics what could not be secured through war, and who was ultimately honored, however belatedly, by the nation that once branded him a rebel. To other Nigerians, including many in the minority ethnic communities of the Old Eastern region, who felt marginalized within Biafra itself, and to Nigerians from the North and West, who lost family members or livelihoods to the war Ojukwu started, his post-war rehabilitation looks more uncomfortable. A state pardon granted for electoral convenience, a state funeral granted for national symbolism, both perhaps outpacing any real reckoning with the up to 2 million civilian deaths. Most from starvation that resulted from the war he led, and that unresolved tension didn't die with him. In the years since Ojukwu's 2011 funeral, renewed Biafra separatist movements, most visibly the indigenous people of Biafra, IPOB, have invoked his name and legacy directly, arguing that Nigeria never delivered on the reconciliation his own post-war life seemed to represent. Whatever peace Ojukwu's later career suggested Nigeria and the Igbo people had reached with one another, it evidently was not the final word. Perhaps that is the most honest way to understand what happened to Ojukwu after Biafra, not as an epilogue that resolved the Civil War, but as an extended, contradictory, deeply human negotiation between one man and the country he once tried to leave. A negotiation that ended only with his death, and whose underlying questions Nigeria is, in many ways, still asking itself today. Closing. Odumegwu Ojukwu spent 3 years trying to build a nation and 4 decades trying to find his place in the one he left behind. Whether history ultimately remembers him as a general, a fugitive, a politician, or a patriarch may depend less on the facts of his life, which are, by now, well documented, and more on which Nigeria, you ask.